Story 1. Telling my nonverbal grandmother that her daughter died made her breathing very labored. I can barely type this without tearing up. Story 2. I am an anesthesiologist, and I usually accompany the surgeon when explaining to the relatives that a patient has died. The most difficult situation was when a pregnant mother arrived with her husband for a cesarean section. The father was carrying a bag filled with baby items such as clothes, a blanket, and a knit cap. Unfortunately, the baby was not alive when delivered. Story 3. I was a front-end manager at a large retail store. I returned from my lunch to find a coroner's van in the parking lot. My manager took me aside and explained that my cashier's 16-year-old little brother had committed suicide by jumping in front of a train, and the coroner needed help breaking the news to him, so I held his hands and told him myself, realizing I was the only one there who was actually friends with the guy outside of work. He collapsed, crying and screaming. I took him home to his girlfriend. The funeral was heartbreaking. The boy was cremated, and his urn was placed on his skateboard. My friend was sobbing, and his dad was fainting half the time. It is permanently seared into my memory. Story 4. This past spring, one of my team members went swimming. At some point, he got his foot caught underwater. 5 minutes went by while he was submerged before anyone was able to get him out. I spent the next few days at the hospital with his wife and son while he was on life support. The family had recently moved here from India and did not speak the local language. Our company was all present since he was one of our senior managers. The chief executive officer was out of town, which made me the most senior person available. On the third day, the doctor informed us that he was brain dead. I had to break the news to his wife and son. Eventually, the decision had to be made to turn off the life support. His wife was devastated. His son, only 10 years old, did not understand what was happening. We waited for hours, ran more tests, checked more scans, and consulted other doctors for second opinions. Medical professionals from India were called to weigh in. The medical staff tried everything they could. Later that night, his wife begged me to be the one to tell the doctors to turn off the life support. I sat with my friend while they turned off his ventilators and held his wife's hand when the blood supply ceased circulating. And then, for the second time in 3 days, I had to tell this woman that her life as she knew it was gone, that her husband was now deceased. Story 5. I had to tell my wife that her mother passed away. While her mother had been in the hospital for a while, and it was not exactly a surprise, it was still a terrible thing to share with her because there was still hope for her recovery. I received the call because I was the one managing the bills. My wife was sleeping, and I had to wake her up to deliver the news. It was a horrible thing to do. I drove her to the hospital, but she didn't want to go in, which made it painful to convince her to see her deceased mother. Story 6. There was a child who was touched inappropriately by a staff member at the elementary school where I worked. I had to call the mother and inform her of what happened. She was devastated and struggled to find the right words. It was one of the saddest moments of my life. I often wonder if everything is okay with the child as she grew up. Story 7. I used to work midnights as a state trooper. Giving death notifications was part of the job. I responded to the scene of a fatality involving a 21-year-old male. The body was severely mangled, a closed casket situation. Since it wasn't my patrol where the accident occurred, my sergeant and I were tasked with making the death notification. After they retrieved his ID, we used the statewide terrorism intelligence center to obtain the address of his parents. We arrived at about 3:30 a.m., knocked on the door, and identified ourselves as the state police. Both parents came to the door simultaneously, and as soon as the mother saw us, she fell to the floor, sobbing and screaming. She knew. The father asked for clarification, and we communicated the information quickly and clearly. Are you the parents of name? Yes. Your son was killed in a motor vehicle accident an hour ago on I-94. I'm sorry. As a trooper, I witnessed many traumatic events. Gunshot wound victims, stabbings, and all kinds of mangled bodies. I was often the first on the scene as someone was bleeding out, and I witnessed countless ejections. However, nothing impacted me quite like those grief-stricken parents. The father's instant denial, saying, No, he was supposed to be at his friend's, are you sure? And the mother repeatedly crying, please, God, no. There's a significant difference between seeing a dead body and not fully grasping the true impact of that lost life versus witnessing the devastating effects it has on those who cared for that person. I compartmentalized many experiences in my career, but the reactions of those parents and the level of devastation I saw in their eyes and heard in their voices still haunt me. I never enjoyed being a police officer, and I know they receive a lot of criticism, but there are many issues they face that aren't discussed enough. They deal with a lot for our sake and to keep society running. I'm now an emergency room mental health counselor and love what I do. I've attended therapy for years and have worked on my own challenges, but many of my former peers have not. In any case, that experience is the one that stands out to me. Story 8. I had to tell my mother, who was in the hospital battling terminal cancer, that her husband, my dad, who was struggling with a lung virus in another hospital, had died. She looked sad and said she had a feeling in her heart that he had passed. My brother and I waited to tell her. We didn't want to share the news immediately. She was already facing a difficult situation, and we wanted her to have the strength to cope rather than delivering such terrible news. Unfortunately, she did not survive her battle either. Story 9. I had to tell my stepmother that she is not getting my father's money or house the day he passed away, after she brought it up in the hospital. It did not go over well. Story 10. I had to tell my 3 children that their mother had been found dead and had committed suicide. It didn't go well. One of my daughters fainted while the other 2 broke into hysterics. It is not something I will ever forget. Additionally, I had a 90-mile drive to make to break the news. Story 11. Having to tell my dad they found a mass in my mom's torso was difficult. It happened last week. We know it's cancer, but we still don't know what type, what stage, or if it's curable or terminal. Let's just say it doesn't look good. They are both around 80 years old and have been married for 55 years. My dad's response after I told him was to tear up and say, if she dies before me, I'll go lay down on her grave and wait for my death like an old faithful dog. I cannot remember the last time I cried this much. I'm still crying as I type this. Story 12. I had to inform parents of a cause of death once the autopsy results were in. It was a calm and poignant moment for them, but my nerves were clearly rattled. Story 13. I called my parents from abroad to inform them that their grandchild died during childbirth and asked if they could get on a plane to care for my son while I attended to the mother, as I was completely devastated. They arrived the day after. Story 14. My mom called me and told me that my grandma had passed away. She couldn't make the phone calls to anyone else, so I had to do it. It was 20 calls. Story 15. I had to call my mother at work to tell her my sister died in a car accident. Before I informed her, I believe it was the last time I heard genuine happiness in her voice when she answered the phone. She has never been the same since. Story 16. My cousin confided in me that her husband had cheated on her, but she told me they were in counseling, working on their relationship, and that he had cut ties and hadn't seen the other woman in 3 months. 2 days later, my husband saw her husband at the grocery store with the mistress, and I had to deliver the news to her. They ended up getting a divorce after that. It was a difficult situation for everyone involved. Story 17. My best friend, who was also a colleague, was on a training course. I called him after work to see how it had gone, but there was no answer. I tried a few more times, and then his girlfriend called to ask if I had heard from him. A short time later, I received a call from an unknown number asking why I had been calling. It was the police, and my friend had been in a serious road traffic accident. They were seeking next of kin details, so I had to contact his boss, girlfriend, and family. The only ones I didn't call were his parents, as I didn't have their number, though I knew where they lived and described that to the police. He was taken off life support 3 days later. He genuinely was one of the best people. Everyone loved him, and he had always been there for me. Words cannot express how different life is without him. Story 18. Call my aunts to inform them that their brother passed away that evening. I kept it brief and clinical. There was no time for too much emotion. It needed to be done. Story 19. My cousin killed her own 5-year-old daughter. I was in the middle of the news chain, so I had to inform a few other relatives. 3 months later, I was the first to find out that my cousin had died in prison. It was a deeply emotional experience. Story 20. Calling your mother, siblings, and her children to inform them that their daughter, sister, and mother was killed by a drunk driver 1 block from her home. Then discovering that the perpetrator was being released after serving only 6 months in jail. Never allow the police to come to your door at 3 a.m. Story 21. I had to tell my daughter that her grandfather died. He was the person she looked up to the most. They loved each other very much. She was 6 when he passed away and had never experienced death before, not even with a pet. When my wife and I told her, she looked at us with tears in her eyes and simply asked, "Why?" That was the hardest thing I have ever had to do. Story 22. With all the people I have helped pass away, I have always found peace in the knowledge that their suffering was over, no matter how much I missed them. Story 23. I called my best friends to tell them my mother passed away. I felt numb and they were crying. It was strange because I couldn't cry. Story 24. I had to call my mother, who was attending my uncle's funeral out of town, to inform her that my dad died at the Harrisburg, Pennsylvania airport. It was probably the worst day of my life. Story 25. I had to call my 2 brothers and my sister long distance from the hospital to tell them that my father had died of a brain aneurysm. We are friends with a couple. One day after church, we were talking with them about how her mother hadn't called her that morning and how unusual it was. The husband offered to drive over to the in-laws' house because he had to go to his nearby office anyway. He arrived to find that her father had murdered her mother and then turned the gun on himself. 10 years later, he is still not right after discovering their bodies and having to inform his wife over the phone. Story 26. Telling my right-wing religious dad I was gay. It is possible to watch someone's face visibly age several years upon hearing unexpected news. Story 27. Telling my dad that he was likely not going to live independently anymore and would need full-time care was difficult. The next day, he fell into a coma that lasted a month before he passed away. During that month, no one knew or could determine what had happened. After his death, it was confirmed that he had late-stage cancer that had spread throughout his body and brain, explaining the coma and other symptoms that prevented him from taking care of himself. In retrospect, telling him that he might never be independent or recover feels emotionally abusive. I deeply regret it. It is one of the most disheartening things I have ever said, and the way I delivered it was terrible. I am now very self-conscious about it, which has diminished my desire to pursue a career as a social worker or therapist. Story 28. My sister, my best friend and soulmate, was always very afraid of death and dying. You know how people say, "I want to have a big stroke and just go right out"? It doesn't necessarily work that way. She had a big stroke. The doctor told me it was fatal, but not yet. She asked me, "Am I going to die?" And oh God, I had to just look at her and say, "Yes. Can it be fixed?" No. I sat with her every single day in hospice for 10 days until she passed. Especially at the start, she was clear enough that we could talk. Not easily, but it was very precious time that I will cherish forever, as well as a source of trauma. She was an old-school stoner. The call came in at 4:20 a.m. I miss her so much. Story 29. I had to tell a woman over the phone that her daughter had passed away. The woman was quite elderly and hard of hearing. Instead of being gentle and careful with my words, I ended up having to yell in the lobby of a medical facility, "Your daughter is dead. I'm so sorry. It was just awful." Later, I found out that the daughter's mobile home had been repossessed, and all her belongings were dumped on the ground. I brought a coworker along to search for sensitive identification and sentimental items to return to the mother. That made me feel a little better about the situation. Story 30. I had to tell my grandma that they were stopping chemotherapy for her youngest daughter because it was too late. I felt like she never forgave me for having that conversation with her. Story 31. I had to tell my parents that the doctor found a small tumor in my brain. It went as you would expect. They were freaking out, crying, and very emotional. "I'm fine, by the way. It's benign." Story 32. I had to inform my manager that her son had died by suicide, and she needed to leave to be with her other son, who discovered him. We were at work, and they had been unable to reach him all day or his girlfriend. It turned out he had shot her and then himself. It went about as well as one could expect. Story 33. I called my college best friend to check on him, as his roommate had died by suicide in their apartment the day before. He didn't know yet. He was student teaching at home that semester and had ignored the calls from the apartment complex. He only stayed at the apartment on weekends and wasn't on social media. I knew because I still lived in town. Story 34. I met my sister at the airport and told her that our mother's cancer had spread everywhere, and the time we thought we had left with her was about to quickly disappear. Story 35. Having to tell an employee that they weren't working enough hours to qualify for employer-sponsored health insurance was difficult. A year later, I had to tell a different employee the same thing. One employee was battling cancer, and the chemotherapy made them too ill to come in. The other had a mystery illness that caused them to lose consciousness randomly, making it unsafe for them to work. It's a horrible catch-22. If you are too ill to work, you not only lose your income, but you also lose the health insurance that pays for your medical treatment. Health insurance should not be tied to employment. It is troubling how this aspect of the system exists so that insurance companies can avoid paying for serious illnesses. It wasn't a death sentence, but I felt like I was pushing them closer to one. Story 36. Telling my children that our dog needed to be euthanized was difficult. He was very old and very sick. I got him before they were born, and they didn't know life without him. Story 37. I had to call my friend at 2 a.m. to tell her that her baby boy was being airlifted after a motorcycle accident. He passed away. I don't think she ever forgave me for calling. I know she blames me. I had to call others to be there when Grandpa died. Again, nothing like killing the messenger. Story 38. I received a call from a nurse informing me that my grandfather was most likely deceased. They couldn't officially declare it until he reached the hospital. My mother wasn't home, so I had to call my father and inform him about my grandfather. That was one of the hardest phone calls I've ever made. To his credit, my father left work immediately without even taking any clothes or belongings with him. When my mother arrived home, we had a difficult conversation. She packed for my father, and the rest of the family went directly to my grandparents' house. Story 39. I informed my younger brother that his goldfish had not run away. He handled it well until he noticed the bowl was empty. Story 40. I had to lay people off. As a result, I stepped out of management because I was never doing that again. I would rather be on the other side. Story 41. Telling my husband that his father had terminal cancer was difficult. For some reason, my father-in-law called me and asked me to tell my husband. It felt unfair, as I had never had to share news like that before, and it seemed as though they were placing the responsibility on me instead of speaking to my husband directly. I then had to inform my children because my husband couldn't bring himself to tell them about their grandfather. I believe that my husband's family had communication issues. When my father-in-law actually died, his uncle called to inform us. My husband left the house and asked me to tell the children that their grandfather had passed away. Story 42. This is much lighter than everything else here. I was working security at a retail store and was asked to bring the mother of a shoplifter to the asset protection office. I allowed her to finish her purchases and asked if she would come with me. She said she didn't speak English well and her son could translate. I had to use my limited Spanish, and we caught her son shoplifting. She looked embarrassed and disappointed. Story 43. I had to tell my wife that her brother had been killed in a trucking accident. It was heart-wrenching. Then we had to go to the hospital where her father was recuperating from surgery and inform him. It was terrible. Story 44. I am deeply sorry for your loss. However, since your husband was deceased when the ambulance arrived, the claim was coded as non-emergent, and your policy only covers emergency ambulance services. It went exactly as you can imagine. Story 45. I had to serve as a casualty notification officer once. I had to inform a spouse that her husband had been killed and then deliver the same message to her daughters. The moment she opened the door and saw the chaplain and me, she knew and broke down. This was probably the hardest thing I had to do during my military career. Story 46. My in-laws went on a trip to Ireland while my mother-in-law's mom was in a nursing home. The only emergency contact they had was my mother-in-law. Unfortunately, they turned off their phones and only communicated through text. My mother-in-law's mom passed away, and the nursing home could not reach anyone. Someone remembered a mutual friend from high school and called her sister, who then contacted me. I had to text my mother-in-law to inform her that her mother had died 6 days ago and no one could be reached. She replied, "Oh well, I already paid for my vacation. I'll be home next week." Story 47. I had to tell my wife, daughter, and parents that I stole a large sum of money and was going to prison. My daughter's shriek will be forever etched in my memory. Story 48. I called my sister to tell her that our mom was in the hospital emergency room, which was operating on a first-come, first-served basis. It was a traumatic experience, but she had her gallbladder removed and is doing fine. I am a sickly, disabled person and have never had to be on the other side of the hospital waiting room. Usually, I am the patient. Story 49. I had to tell a room full of people waiting to throw a surprise party that their guest of honor had died. My best friend and her passenger died in a car accident. That passenger was set to move across the country the next day, so his friends were throwing him a surprise going-away party. They were all waiting for him when I got the news. I didn't know him, but we had some mutual friends. The police weren't able to reach his family, so when I contacted some mutual friends, they put me on speakerphone for the whole group. I shared what I knew, that he had died. They didn't believe me and thought I was mistaken. Some yelled at me. I was going through my own emotions regarding my friend, so I was not in the right state to deliver that news. It was awful for everyone. Story 50. I called my sister to tell her our father died of a heart attack. I performed CPR until the paramedics arrived, but I was not able to save him. I live with that guilt every day for 30 years. Story 51. I informed my friend group that my best friend of 25 years had a massive medical emergency due to COVID-19. He was in critical condition. I had to call each one of them individually. For our closest friends, it cut me to the core. For our extended friends, it was unbearable. The innocent yet painful questions they would ask lingered in my mind. I then had conversations with our friends to piece together his final wishes and preferences for medical treatment, which I delivered to his mother. We're not young, but we're definitely not old enough to endure what he faced, and it was not a conversation we had prepared for. Speaking with her felt like losing a part of myself. Calling them back to inform them of his passing was a significant event. I also had to serve as the master of ceremonies at his large celebration of life, and every word that came out of my mouth carried weight. This was a few years ago, and I've never mentioned it to anyone. I find myself crying now, and I appreciate the opportunity to share. Story 52. I, a 25-year-old female, had to tell my sister, who is 27, that our sister, age 30, died by suicide from an overdose. She was a mother of 2, and her children, ages 7 and 10, were the ones who found her and called 911. Calling my sister was by far the worst of a long series of calls I had to make since my parents were pretty distraught. She, like everyone else, completely broke down. I was away at school at the time, so it was extremely hard to have all these conversations over the phone while trying to make it home. Story 53. I told my younger sisters that our dog passed away earlier that morning. I had to hold back my tears when I took them to McDonald's to create a good memory before sharing the news. I still miss him. We all do. Story 54. I was 17. My siblings and I were at home alone for a few weeks because our dad was sick. He was 900 kilometers away building a new house for us, and our mom had left us some money and rushed to his side. Mom called to tell me that Dad had passed away. She believed I was the most responsible, even though I had an older sister and brother, so she asked me to inform the rest of the siblings. It was the hardest thing I have ever done. Telling my younger brother, who was 15, that he had to come home so we could talk was difficult. He panicked and refused to leave the pinball arcade while I tried to get him to come home so I could tell him peacefully and quietly. In the end, I had to tell him right there in the middle of a shop full of people. He called me a liar and then started crying. After that, I had to wait for my older brother and sister to come home from high school so I could tell them, too. Story 55. My grandpa went out to the supermarket, and when she came back, I had to tell her and my uncle that her dad died peacefully in bed. I was in the other room playing with my sister and went to check on him to find out he had passed away. Story 56. I am not nearly as sad as these stories, but I was at home holding my girlfriend's dying cat when it took its last breath. I had to call her and share the news. Other than that, I have always been the one receiving bad news. I have 4 close friends and multiple family members, and I am only 34. That's when my life began to change. Everything feels so trivial after you start losing the people you love. Story 57. My grandmother passed away on Christmas Eve when I was in 8th grade. My uncle called and informed me while I was home alone. I had to tell my mother when she returned from work. It was a difficult experience, and I still feel upset with my uncle more than 25 years later for putting that burden on me. Story 58. I received a call from a hospital's palliative care department. My fiancé had been taken to the hospital the day before and was transferred to a cancer specialty hospital. They couldn't reach his father, so it was up to me to inform him that his oldest son was in a coma and that the situation didn't look good. I also needed to ask him to contact family members and let them know. His father, bless his heart, took the news matter-of-factly and asked me if I was okay, but I wasn't. Story 59. I told my sister that the medical examiner would never speak to her and that it would take 12 weeks to determine the cause of death for her son. I knew this because my daughter had died 10 months earlier. My sister and I both lost our second children. My other sister and I lost our husbands in the same year. Story 60. Telling my 8-year-old son that his granddad had passed away after a long fight with cancer was incredibly difficult. He was his best friend, and he adored him. I have never felt more broken by anything in my life, and if I never have to feel that again, it will be too soon. Story 61. My dad had a tragic accident in which he choked. There seems to be a pattern of indifference in my family. No one cared to ask any questions. As a single mother at that time, I waited until the last moment to get to his city, which was 4 hours away. Eventually, I arrived and started demanding answers. The doctors told me everything, and I literally face-bombed. Because of his choking incident, my dad was brain dead since his brain didn't receive oxygen for over 5 minutes. This caused several epileptic attacks, at least 4 per minute, even while on medication. He was gone. There was really nothing the doctors could have done to save him. No one, it seemed, thought to ask any questions. I had to inform my entire family of over 20 members about what was happening. I was so flabbergasted. He choked on a Thursday, and I arrived on Saturday. How did not one of them think to ask any questions? Anyway, I was the one informing everyone about my dad's condition and the fact that we could not save him. I was the one signing every document and making funeral arrangements, which felt incredibly wrong because, along with my sisters, we are the youngest in the family. In that moment, I saw several family members break down. Perhaps it wasn't indifference, but a desire to avoid hurting anyone else. But still, not even my older brother stepped up. I have needed therapy since that day. I will never forget my cousin, the calmest person among us cousins, who cried as if there was no tomorrow. He hugged me like I was a lifeline. He was truly devastated by my dad's passing, which deepened my grief and guilt because my dad was so loved, and I was the one who signed the papers to end life support. Story 62. I informed my father that he had a few days to a couple of weeks left to live due to an untreatable medical complication. My sister was horrified that I revealed this to him. His sisters were angry and said I was wrong for not trusting in faith over the doctors. He lost consciousness after a few days and passed away 2 weeks later. Story 63. Telling my sister our grandmother was dying of pancreatic cancer was easily the worst day of my entire 36 years of life. My sister has never taken bad news well, so my best friend and I picked her up and said we were going to visit our grandmother because she wanted to talk to her. She was definitely suspicious, but I managed to play it off as nothing. If you don't know, pancreatic cancer can turn you yellow. When we arrived at the assisted living home, I opened the door and pushed her in. The second I heard, "Grandma, why are you yellow?" I shut the door, dropped to the ground, and sobbed. I was young, and at the time it seemed like the easiest way to break the news without her hearing it directly from me. She was so angry with me. She has forgiven me since then, but I can't forgive myself for doing that to her. I feel like I should have known better, but I was so scared and so tired. I promised to never hide anything from her like that again, and to this day, I've kept my word. Story 64. Telling my son that his dad was dead remains the hardest thing I've ever had to do. I found out while I was at work. Although I could have gone straight home, I didn't feel ready to tell my child what had happened. My son cried, and I reassured him that it's okay to cry and to feel sad. We attended a supportive group, and he has had several therapists since the incident 7 years ago in March. Story 65. My grandfather had dementia, which was mild until his wife of over 50 years passed away. It seemed to get much worse overnight. For the following 2 weeks, I had to tell him multiple times a day that she had died. He would then feel guilty for forgetting, and the grief process would start over again. It was like a series of endless memories from hell. Story 66. Telling my sister that her son died was the worst. I don't want to think about it enough to say more. Story 67. I called my parents to tell them I have stage 3 breast cancer, an aggressive type with the worst prognosis and the highest rate of recurrence. They were devastated, and I could barely get the words out. Story 68. Telling my 2 young children that I had cancer was incredibly difficult. As a single mother, this news devastated our family for many years. Story 69. Not exactly me, but it was that kind of moment. We had to tell my dad that there was no more to be done. He had heart and kidney failure, and when admitted to the hospital, they hooked him up to all the life-saving measures. He was lucid, but it just wasn't working. Our family met privately with the medical team as they delivered the news to us, and I broke down asking, "How do you tell someone who is ready to fight that there is nothing left to be done?" The nurses were all tearing up along with our family as we sobbed, beside ourselves with how to deliver this news. The doctor then joined us in explaining it to Dad. The doctor's calm, professional, and tactful delivery was a gift to my family, something we simply didn't know how to do. He didn't exactly say, "We're unplugging everything now. You probably have 6 hours left," but he did say something more along the lines of, "Things aren't working, so we're going to shift to making you more comfortable." I thought my dad would respond with, "So when will I be home?" But he knew. He understood. He just said, "Okay." Story 70. A few years ago, it was very close to Christmas Day, and it was late at night, around 2 a.m. I was still awake using my laptop in the kitchen when I went into the living room and found my partner's elderly cat dying behind one of the couches. I went to our bedroom and told my partner that something was wrong with the cat and she needed to come with me. She dismissed it, saying there was nothing she could do, and went back to sleep. I stayed with the cat, petting her and saying goodbye until she passed away. I covered her up and took her to the garage. I went to sleep feeling very sad. In the morning, I woke up and started crying. I could barely talk, and I didn't want to tell my partner that her cat was dead. But I managed to tell her what happened, and she cried a lot. We buried her in the backyard a few hours later. It was the first and only time I had to deliver news like that. Story 71. I told my mom that my dad passed away. My aunt called me at school. I drove home, and as soon as I walked into her room, she knew what had happened. It was the worst day of my life. Story 72. Not nearly as heartbreaking as the other replies, but I work at the reception of an emergency veterinary clinic. When a pet arrives and isn't breathing, we must immediately ask the owners if they would like us to perform cardiopulmonary resuscitation. Usually, a member of the medical team asks these questions, but there have been a few instances where everyone is busy with the emergency and I've had to ask. Typically, the owners realize their pet is in critical condition by the time they reach us, but asking that question confirms to them that their pet isn't breathing, and they must make a decision immediately. Every time I've had to ask, I need some time to cry afterward. Story 73. I told one of my closest friends that our mutual friend had died. He was 17 and we were 19 or 20 and in college while our friend was still in high school. Our college and high school were very close, so we would often go to watch the high school football games after we finished practice. I have never in my life, before or since, heard anyone wail. She dropped the phone, and her mom picked up. This was in the days before smartphones, and was understandably concerned, asking why her daughter was screaming and crying, so I had to tell her the news as well. This took place well over 20 years ago, and I remember every detail vividly. Story 74. My cousin, who was my best friend, passed away. Now everyone wants me to deliver all the bad news to everyone. Story 75. I had to find a couple on their vacation and tell them that their teenage son had taken his own life. It was devastating for all of us. I was a close friend of the family. Story 76. I informed my client, who is over 70 years old, that he lost his appeal on a 30-year sentence. He seemed unable to understand what I was saying. Confused, he asked, "So I have to stay here longer?" Story 77. My boss, who was my father, had me threaten to fire an employee, who was my sister-in-law. She was never a good employee again, and it ultimately destroyed my relationship with my father. Story 78. Not me, but my sister. She called to tell me that my dad was being removed from the ventilator and I needed to say goodbye. I am hard of hearing and didn't hear my phone ringing. She had to call my partner, who woke me up to talk with her. It was the worst call I've ever received, and I'm sure it was the worst one she has ever made. We both still miss him and talk about him often. I hold a lot of guilt and regret for not being able to get home to support her and him. Story 79. I had to call my aunt to let her know that my mom, her sister, had been killed and my sister was fighting for her life as well. Luckily, she is now alive and well. This was 2 years ago, and I still remember her voice after I told her. I could barely talk because I was hyperventilating, crying, and choking. After I told her, she asked, "What? Are you serious?" Since she obviously didn't want to believe it. My response was, "Well, unless this is some dark Halloween prank." I don't even know why I said that. In desperate times, I tend to make bad jokes. We later laughed about it, but I wish I could have filtered myself. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.